Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you all. And of course, a special welcome to Anna Blackman, who's going to lead us this evening. And I thought that we might try to start the evening with a Pax Christi Scotland prayer from our new prayer card. So if you'll bear with me while I let just one more person in, and then we could just settle for a prayer. Dear Father in heaven, you see every injustice, every violent act, every contravention of peace. We seek your guidance as we turn to our earthly leaders, hoping to change hearts, convince minds, and empower them to bring peace to the innocent. We pray that you will comfort the wounded, the bereaved, the disinherited. Lord, help us to make our common home a haven of non-violence. Amen. And apart from giving a plug to say if anyone would like some of those prayer cards, just email me. I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of Anna. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, and it's really wonderful to see all of you again and see a few new faces. I really enjoyed last session, so I'm really looking forward to today. And what really struck me after our first meeting, both Marion and I spoke about it afterwards, we were just really blown away by really stimulating discussion, actually, how honest everyone was, and that was just really wonderful. So in today's session, I'm going to try and allow a little bit more time for people talking and learning from each other, and try and give a bit more space for that, because I think that was really, really great last time. So today's session, we're going to think about why non-violence, so why the church might want to opt for non-violence, why the world might want to opt for non-violence. We'll also think a little bit about what's brought us to non-violence. I know we spoke a little bit about it last time, but we'll try and go into a bit more depth today. And as I said in the documents and emails that Marion sent out, this is a question that we will keep thinking about throughout the project. We're maybe not going to solve all of why non-violence today, but I just want to give us a bit of an overview today of the themes that we'll look at to start the conversation. And we'll think about some of the theological and practical arguments for non-violence to give us a grounding for going forward. So to begin with, I thought I would share a little bit about my journey of non-violence, and but mainly because what I found really powerful actually is listening to other people's testimonies, and I thought it would be nice for us to share if people are comfortable to do that. And I think listening to other people has really helped me to understand why they commit to non-violence, but also thinking about what it looks like in people's lives and how they try and employ that and how it relates to their faith. So I'll begin by sort of answering the question of why non-violence matters to me, explain a little bit about my own conversion to non-violence, then give us a bit of time to reflect on our own stories, and then we'll go over the key points from the text that we've been looking at this month. So for me, undoubtedly, the Catholic worker movement has been the biggest influence on my own conversion, and also has really shaped my understanding of what I think it means to be church. If people haven't heard of the Catholic worker movement, I can talk a little bit about it afterwards if people want. But I'll just go through it briefly for the moment. And really, I came across this completely accidentally. I was studying for my master's at Durham and accidentally came across Catholic social teaching, which I had never heard of before, which is probably quite shocking at 21. But this really radical understanding of justice and peace, putting faith into action, was really something that I'd never really come across before in my growing up in my faith life. And I really just wanted to learn more about it. And then again, very accidentally, a lecturer suggested that I might be interested in the Catholic worker movement as a grassroots activist way of trying to put CST into action. So I began studying this as an example of Catholic social practice, but really without any knowledge of Catholic nonviolence. So my journey into nonviolence really began actually pretty intellectually and theologically. And I think probably it started as kind of a conversion of my mind. So I was studying the writings of the co-founders, Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. And here they speak about their kind of literal understanding of the New Testament, and how this is really just inherently intertwined with a commitment to peace and nonviolence. We can see this in the example of Dorothy Day's life, but also in the way she talks about nonviolence and her own faith. So she, reflecting on the mystical body, she states that we are all members one of another. Where the health of one member suffers, the health of the entire body is lowered. And because of this, because we're all joined in this body, she thinks that Christians must have alternatives to violence, and talks about violence as literally rendering the mystical body of Christ. So when we fight each other, when we're in conflict, because we're all part of this mystical body, we're literally tearing it apart. And understanding of nonviolence within this community really struck me as taking the demands of the gospel to their logical conclusion, and really changed how I understood the gospel. And then I ended up working and living in Catholic worker communities, and spent some time in America living in a Catholic worker community in Indiana. And I think then I went through a sort of second conversion process where nonviolence was not just sort of theologically logical, but I saw it also being embodied in practice, and how it could be done. And that was something that I had actually been really tentative about before. It seemed like a really nice idea. I thought it seemed really theologically sound, but I didn't really get how it would work in practice, particularly in a world that was filled with so much violence. For Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, the movement's co-founders, the Sermon on the Mount really served as their manifesto for Christian practice. And the movement aimed to literally put these gospel principles of peacemaking, loving the enemy, into daily practice. And they did that through hospitality to the marginalized, through trying to build up communities, but also through resistance against violence and injustice. And living in those communities, aiming to live in solidarity with the marginalized, trying to work for those structures of peace and justice, also acknowledging perhaps how we failed in that. But also praying together as a community really transformed how I saw nonviolence, but also how I saw it as being effective. And it really helped me to realize that it wasn't just a nice premise, it wasn't something that's just reserved for really radical activists, but something that we can really put into practice in our daily lives. Also, I think nonviolence is, at least for me, an ongoing journey. It's an ongoing conversion process. I sort of feel constantly like I'm reflecting on my own complicity with violence. And which is to say, I don't think I live a perfectly non-violent life. I think it's hard when we're in systems that are so intertwined in violence. We're constantly having to check ourselves. And I think that is a very challenging position to come to, especially even when we're just doing basic actions like doing our food shopping. You're constantly having to think about what are the violent structures, what's behind all of this. And I think it's an ongoing process of unpicking all of those things. Today, when I talk about myself as being non-violent, I would say I'm more striving towards non-violence. I'm trying to educate myself as much as I can on how to embody it, reflecting on where I failed, trying again, but also being committed to a non-violent reading of the Gospels and the belief that I think this is how we're called to act, and living in this hope that non-violence defeats violence. So what I would like us to, if people are happy to, I know we did share a bit about what brought us to the group last time, why we were interested in nonviolence. I want us to spend a few minutes thinking a bit deeper today about why we might choose nonviolence, what motivates us to do so, and maybe a bit about what our journey towards nonviolence has looked like. So even if you think your journey is perhaps just beginning, or maybe it's one where you're sort of thinking about how nonviolence resonates with you, or questioning how it could work, that's all fine. But I think if we just take a few minutes to reflect on this, and then if people feel comfortable, I'll invite you to share your reflection. So I'll just put the question in the chat. Um, so I think maybe maybe if we sort of have 3 minutes just for sort of reflection by ourselves, and then we can sort of hear from people. Does that sound all right? So I just invite people to share if they want to, either in the chat or if you want to speak a bit about what you've been thinking about. Thanks, Marion, for sharing. So you're saying witnessing dramatic non-violence in a conflict situation motivated you, but also finding it challenging to be non-violent at all times as an individual.
Can I come in?
Please.
Yeah, I agree with what Marion said there. I think as long as the first time I ever thought about violence, I found it quite a horrific thing. So I've always been inclined to be against it. I mean, probably not helped by the fact that being rather small, I was more likely to lose fights. So in other words, that helped. But I think, and I still think it's right, and so much of it. I've always thought a lot of violence occurs because people don't listen to each other, don't look at the other person's point of view. And I've always thought that. Um, but I must confess, I find it very difficult sometimes. I'm very skeptical about the effectiveness of non-violence. You know, going right back to the early days of marching against the bomb. I remember, I think I signed the peace pledge. was very young, but I signed something for the Peace Pledge Union. And I remember getting papers, and one of the papers talking about the Second World War said the way that it should have been dealt with, everybody should just have refused to fight. They should have just have sat there. And but I could see how that would work, but so many people would die in the process. I just find the amount of courage that would be required beyond belief, really.
David has a hand up.
Oh, yeah, David, do you want to come in on this one?
Come on, there we are. Yeah, yeah. I started when I was at school because we had an officer training corps, and one of my schoolmates, said, David, he said, are you a Christian? So I said, yes. Well, he said, if you're a Christian, you should love your neighbour, shouldn't you? Yes. Well, that rather rules out killing them, doesn't it? I said, yes. And at that stage, I mean, I was thinking very much about everyone being created in the image of God, and everyone being a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so that was the intellectual bit. And then I got involved in campaigns on nuclear disarmament and direct action. But the second major thing was when I was working over in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s, and finding that a lot of the discussion I was having with people wasn't about what should they do as Christians and followers of Jesus, but whether or not nonviolence would be a more successful strategy and tactic to achieve particular ends. And having those discussions, interesting, was in a sense with both sides. And I suppose the Ulster Workers' Council actually used non-violent action to get rid of Stormont, which is always a bit challenging. But over time, I don't think I've had any sort of major sort of angst about challenges. What I have found as now a retired priest with the Episcopal Church is just profound frustration with the church that something to me seems so blindingly obvious is just not appreciated. And what that does is it can grind you down over time. You just feel you one or two people in a particular area, and you just get patted on the head and said, "Oh yes, David, that's your thing, isn't it?" I said, "No."
Thank you so much for sharing that, David. I think there's a lot of really, really important points in what you said. And I really love that example that you're talking about from school. Just actually the real simplicity of it was really quite amazing. And yeah, thank you, Kit, as well, because I think it's an ongoing frustration perhaps and challenge, I think. Anne-Marie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. I was just really sort of some thoughts that came into my head while Kit was speaking. It's all I've always sort of not always of something when I was like a child, I never knew what it was, but I've never really not from a Catholic perspective sort of you know thought that war was wrong or that kind of a thing. Like I've always kind of thought that. But maybe when I was younger or whatever, like didn't really know why I thought that. I just had a deep-rooted feeling that was wrong. And then as I sort of got older and grew more in my faith and became more involved in like human rights stuff and politics stuff and all that, I really, really found a way to sort of marry all those things up, like there's secular perspectives on non-violence, there's theological perspectives on non-violence, and I find it really like affirming to find the real strong justification in your Christian faith for non-violence and like anti-war advocacy and stuff like that. But what I also find really difficult, and I don't know the answer to this, like I'd imagine you could write a really massive essay on this and like still not conclude anything, and it just comes from what Kit was saying. Like, I wonder how I would, so now I feel that all war's wrong, right? And I feel that in any situation we should be like pursuing diplomatic means and dialogue and all those sorts of, and non-violent resistance and all those sorts of things. But I wonder how I would have felt about that if I was alive in the Second World War. Like, you know, if I was alive at the time of Hitler and the Holocaust and all that sort of a thing, would there have been something bearing upon you as a Christian to actually say, you know, if the only way against this is to fight, you know, like just war theory and all that. And like now I would put forward the argument that just war theory doesn't really stand because of the way that war has developed, like technologically with AI and all that. But I just really, really struggle of how would my beliefs or my opinion have held up if I was alive then, you know? What would I think? Or if I was in Ukraine or Gaza today, could I say those things that I think now? And I don't know, and I don't know, and I struggle with that, and I would love to know what other people would say to that, you know? It's hard.
Marianne, I'm just gonna, Elizabeth just put about her experiences about the inspiration of the Atlas Mountain Martyrs as well. So thank you for sharing that. Marianne, do you want to come in?
Yes, please. Following on Kit and Anne-Marie, I would have agreed with them totally, except for an experience that I had in Romania, where I saw something at first hand, and I've shared this with some of my Pax Christi Scotland colleagues before, but as a journalist, I was sent to Romania immediately after the execution of Ceausescu, the dictator. A photographer and I arrived sort of 2 days later, and we were in the main square, which was pockmarked with bullets. There had been huge violence, and of course his regime had been one of great violence as well. And there were maybe about 10,000 people in that big square. And the word went round that they were going to march to the television studio, because that's what you do when you've had a coup, you take over the television station as well. So we were going to go with them, this crowd, this 10,000 people, and the route went past the police headquarters, which was where a lot of the regime's violence had taken place. And I mean, this was just 2 days after Ceausescu had been shot. And the photographer and I were, I admit completely, we were scared. We were very scared. And we were sort of at the head of the column, trying to keep ahead of all of these people. And the photographer said to me, what are we going to do if, you know, the cops from the old regime come out and open fire on all of these people? And I said, we just run down a dark alley and get out of the way as quickly as we can. But as they went past that building, they knelt, and they were carrying candles, and they all knelt down in waves outside that police headquarters. And a lot of them might have been tortured in there. A lot of them might have lost relatives in there. But they knelt down outside in utter silence, this 10,000 crowd. And that, to me, was a turning point in knowing what non-violence was. And I had never experienced it before. I'd been in war situations before where people just were shooting each other and being, you know, war. And I saw that in action, and it just blew my mind away. And I can't ever forget that. It's something that will always remain with me. And so sometimes what I said about, you know, finding it challenging as an individual, you know, when we get crabbit with people and aren't non-violent with our our neighbours and friends, you think, my God, if they could do that, you know, for heaven's sake, pull yourself together, woman. Thank you. Sorry, I've taken up too much time.
No.
No, thank you very much for sharing. That was a really wonderful example. Would anyone else like to share anything or come in and to respond to anything? Oh, Rosalind, and then Zoom user.
No, it's just this is very personal to myself. When back in the 1960s, there was a lot of things going on around the world with various civil rights movements, and I had cousins who were involved in civil rights movements in Northern Ireland, and they followed this path of nonviolence. And initially, they'd suffered discrimination and prejudice for 40, 50 years, not able to vote, not able to get a house, etc. But they thought nonviolence was the best way forward, but went on marches, were beaten up, terribly badly injured. Eventually, some of them were killed. And you then have to for many of them, that was a big decision then was, well, are we going to say nonviolence doesn't work and resort to violence, or do we keep on with the non-violence? And that was a huge decision for them to make. And some went one way and some went the other. I don't know what I would do in that situation. I think that's what some of the others were sharing. But I've always had this feeling when people talk about justice and peace, and they say you can't have peace without justice. But I often turn that round and say, well, you actually can't have justice without peace. But it doesn't mean peace in the meaning of, ending fighting each other. It means what we are ourselves and inside ourselves. So quite often I find myself making that discussion with people. No, we have to look at the peace bit, perhaps more importantly than the justice, or certainly as important. And sort of that's where it comes from me, I think, looking back on the decisions that some of them had to make. And sadly, the consequences of what then happened, weighs very heavily on a lot of them.
Thank you so much for sharing that really personal and I think really, very powerful example. Thank you. I can't hear you though, you have to unmute.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you very much for last week and for sending the recording, because it enabled me to catch up with everything. I think it's been I've spent an awful lot of time thinking about this since our last meeting, and it's brought back so much to me that I really don't know where to start. But I suppose maybe I started off when I was finished my studies and I joined VSO, and I was sent to a Catholic mission school in the south of India. And I was kind of really, I thought this was just pure nirvana. And I was into Gandhi's country and into peace and Nehru and the rest of it. And then 3 months into my time there was a call for one of the boys. This was a technical boarding school. And they came to tell him that his father had been shot dead by the police. And literally within 50 miles of where I was teaching, there had been a festival to the goddess Kali. And although there was prohibition in the area at the time, there was a lot of drink taken. The police intervened, a small number, and the police were seized by the people and stripped, and they were going to sacrifice them. And they were in the process of going through some kind of ritual when they managed to escape to the parish priest's house, strangely enough. And then the police returned and they just shot into the crowd and they killed 300 or 400 people dead just like that. And I suppose I suddenly thought, wow, Gandhi now, and then this happens. But that's, maybe I'm not explaining myself, but it's just brought up an awful lot of stuff for me. I think I know that this is the answer. I suppose I've had a backwards and forwards relationship with the church at times too. That hasn't been, it's hard sometimes to find kind of great encouragement or inspiration in the local parish church, if I could put it that way. And then I had read on my way out to India a book. I picked it up in the airport, and I went to Sri Lanka and I met this man who was the head of a movement called the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement. And it's now the biggest cooperative movement in the world. And he was trying to live a synthesis of Buddhism, Christianity, and Hinduism, which ultimately didn't succeed for him. But I sort of, my sense is that that's where the answer is. And Schumacher had said that this movement was the best expression of his work and the best expression of his views, and that he expressed in Small is Beautiful. So this is all a bit of a roundabout way of trying to say that I think that if we're embedded in that kind of place, then it becomes easier to answer this question. That's just my thought at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much, and some really lovely examples. Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to share? Rab, yeah.
I think what you were just saying, and others have said about where you're embedded. I think I mentioned last week that one of the things I found the stuff in the book tremendous to open up my mind about the. One of the earliest memories I have is growing up and my dad's and my uncles talking about how fascism was beat in the UK when the Clydesiders went down in their trains, and then Gable Street stood up to them and smashed them. And that was the basic understanding of how you defeat the opposition. And it was that, like I mentioned last, of looking upon liberation struggles, and especially, I think when there was that revolutionary violence and the ideal sounded good, my wife and I, when we were 16, 17, started a youth club, and we called it Shays after Che Guevara. And we got this tremendous stuff sent to us from Cuba. And when you came down into the club, there was this huge mural of Che Guevara, you know, with the famous one when you entered. And that was the whole thrust. A lot of it was looking at Vietnam and what side you should be on. On one side, it was when we left the youth club and came off the management of it, they then replaced Che Guevara with Mickey Mouse, which I thought was a bit offensive, really. But there you go. But it was reading in the book that sense of that, and in Northern Ireland, I think they were quite fortunate in that often the people who can do the killing and can do the violence aren't the people that can build the peace. And I think within the book, there was examples of how so many revolutionary movements with high ideals just hadn't brought that about for the people. They turned sometimes into worse than they were fighting against. And that one of, you know, in how I would respond myself. If I thought, yes, my children, my grandchildren, there's forces coming, and it's that one of thinking, unless the non-violence and the way, I think synodality is a great step towards a way of being and interacting with others. I think we're an even more violent society without people beating up. but the political rhetoric and so much of what you see on social media is really violent. I mean, it's just shocking. It's so divisive and everything, and it's how we can work at overcoming that in some way. And I think, as somebody mentioned, it's that soul searching, and as a former teacher, thinking, yeah, I mean, we'd abolished the belt and everything, but it's really how much did you build up that respect and that opportunity for people to live with each other. Last thing was, I remember when we went for our marriage instruction with the Catholic Dominican priest, lovely guy. He gave me as a present the book of the life story of Camila Torres, who was a revolutionary priest in Colombia. So it was interesting, because I thought that was, yeah, this is what Christians of today should be doing, you know. But there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that point about, yeah, where you're embedded and what you're surrounded by is actually really, really important. Yeah, really good point. Anything else that anyone would like to share? No? Okay, I'm gonna try and speak to or probably do a very bad job of summarising what people have spoken about, because I think there's a lot of questions, and I think we will keep journeying together with this. I mean, I think for me, I think this is why I talk about it as a conversion. I think it's a very personal thing, and I think it does start with your individual commitments, really. And I think there's that conversion, but also there's the formation aspect as well of knowing how to do it, and then the practice of, you need to, I think you need to keep practicing nonviolence so that you know what to do in those situations. One example that happened recently is that I'd just actually given a talk on nonviolence in the church and nonviolent ecclesiology, and immediately after that I was getting the tube back with my partner, and he got mugged, which was a really horrible violent experience. But you're thinking about your initial, and he was like, oh, my initial reaction was I just wanted to hit the person. And he was like, but that's not, we've just been to a non-violent talk. And I was like, but you have to, it's a practice and it's a formation, it's an ongoing journey, I think, and it's constantly checking your impulses, I suppose, and sort of practicing what we do in those situations. But I think, again, it is personal, and thinking, I think perhaps thinking about what our views are and our morality and what we think we should do, perhaps without sort of maybe passing judgment on others in different situations. I think some really good points raised about sort of the effectivity of non-violence, which we'll talk about a bit, and sort of ideas of suffering, which again I think we'll sort of be talking about throughout this ongoing conversation. But I think this bit about encouragement in the church and where you're embodied or embedded is really important. And I think for me, that's probably why I did find it in those worker communities. When you are living with other people who are committed to non-violence, you're in a community that's supporting each other, you're embedded in that world. And it can be very hard to do in isolation, I think. And just even keeping that hope going, I find that hard sometimes. When you're seeing things in the news and you're seeing so much violence, it can be very hard to keep going with that hope. And I think those ideas of community and support are really quite essential. And I think part of non-violence is about building communities. It is about building those foundations, not just to challenge violence, but also to build different kinds of structures. And I think that's really important. And just sort of finally speaking about this, I would encourage you to read the article that Marion sent out kindly to everyone, which is about why the moral argument for non-violence matters. And I think that's actually a really nice response to lots of the things we've been speaking about, because it isn't just about people using non-violence as a tactic and it's effective, but it's sort of going beyond that, and what does it do beyond that? How is it a personal sort of conversion process? And I think that's a really nice example of that. So what I'm going to do next is just talk us through, just give a summary really of what the text says in relation to some of these questions, and then we'll have a bit of time to discuss this based around what the book has brought up. So there's three particular ways that I think the book talks about these questions. So it talks a bit about the history of nonviolence and violence, talks about the theological commitments, and then also the effectivity of violence. And again, these are all things that we'll sort of keep coming back to and keep asking these questions. But just to give us a bit of an overview. So start with the sort of the history, or perhaps the development of violence and conflict over the last century. I think, as people have already raised, we are seeing this changing nature of violence and war. So it is things like nuclear weapons that people have brought up, and weapons of mass destruction, obviously more new developments in military technology like drones, which are just really fundamentally changing the landscape of violence. Also, the way that wars and conflicts are fought is changing too. So it's more intrastate, so sort of non-state actors, whether that's terrorism or gangs, rather than big interstate conflict. And part of what that also means is that there's less discrimination between who's a soldier and who's a non-combatant, but also increased harming of non-combatants as well. I think we've also seen a greater awareness of the devastating impacts of conflict. Both the book talks about the physical, but also the economic, psychological trauma, the moral injury that comes from, even just in the military, we find moral injury of people feeling like they've been asked to act out of accordance with their moral compass, and the trauma that they experience from that. And then obviously environmental destruction is a huge factor now. I think also these broader understandings of what violence is, so systematic, institutional, and structural. But then also over the last centuries, or sort of seeing this growth and success of popular non-violent movements that have worked, and the research and scholarship over the last 40 years of people trying to figure out why these are so successful, when does it work, when does it not, etc. So things like the Indian independence movement, the civil rights movement. Then within the church, we can see the church reading these signs of the times. So it's looking to both the global spread of violence, but also the global spread of non-violence. And I think particularly important, especially since Vatican II, there's been a real focus on it's actually much harder to justify just war because of this changing nature of conflict, particularly these weapons of mass destruction. So at least since Vatican II, we've seen this increasing papal, episcopal focus on non-violence as being at the core of the gospel. Again, I think, as Rosalind was saying, being really intertwined with this nature of peace and justice. Also, increasing growth of Catholic groups on the ground practicing non-violence, which we'll look at in some of the later sessions. And a corresponding growth of theological and biblical reflection on non-violence. And I think particularly with the papacy of Pope Francis, we're seeing non-violence is really coming to the fore. And I think, as Rab pointed out, we are seeing that in the Synod as well. So we've seen that in some of the synthesis reports from the Synod. They talk about non-violence, both within and without the church. And I think that kind of speaks to non-violence is gaining traction within the church, but also perhaps needing this further reflection and further sort of formation. So why non-violence theologically? I'll just go over this briefly because we will come back to these themes. But I think fundamentally there is sort of this renewal or resurgence that we're seeing of it being a core part of faithfulness to the gospel. So the idea that Jesus proclaims non-violence, he lives non-violently. The Catholic Non-Violence Initiative says that affirms that active non-violence is at the heart and vision of the message of Jesus. So when we think about loving our enemies. Also really important within the Catholic tradition, the belief in this God-given dignity of the human person, the sacredness of human life, which I think people also brought up. But also thinking about what it means to act in accordance with our true nature. So rather than seeing humanity as inherently violent, our true nature is we're called to love, we're called to be in relationality with other people, sort of in this model of the Trinitarian relationship. And then obviously how it speaks to lots and lots of different principles within Catholic social teaching. So the call to solidarity, the call to the common good, care for creation, the option for the poor and the marginalised, our rights and responsibilities. And then thinking about the effectivity. So I think within the frame of gospel nonviolence, ultimately, understandings of gospel nonviolence, they're not necessarily about the results or the end outcome. It's really about this faithfulness to the gospel, how God calls us to live. We can also see that nonviolence does have a very real impact as well. And if you haven't heard a look already, it's a really good book by Stephan and Chenoweth, and Why Civil Resistance Works. And they basically have surveyed a lot of different civil resistance movements, trying to figure out why they work and what tactics work. And they, from their survey of all of these acts of resistance, they found that explicitly non-violent actions are twice as effective as violent actions. They argue that part of the reason for this is because that they're much more likely to generate and sustain popular support, also much more inclusive, so you don't have to be sort of, I suppose, an able-bodied soldier. Anyone can participate in a non-violent movement, really. And they're also 10 times more likely to lead to peaceful and democratic societies. So part of that is to say that the method for achieving change affects the outcome as well of what that future society is going to look like. We can also think about how violence is actually really effective. So if we look at human history, violence has not solved the problem of violence. It hasn't led to peace. And we can think about how violence creates cycles of violence, of retaliation. I think we can also see in all the conflicts that are happening at the moment, the arms race, this myth of kind of, if we build up our stocks, if we have nuclear weapons, that'll prevent conflict. That clearly has not happened. And really non-violence is about rather trying to interrupt these cycles rather than perpetuating them. But also, I think non-violence goes further than this. So it's challenging and transforming violence at the personal, communal, structural, institutional levels. It really goes beyond what violence and conflict try to address. And it's more about way of life, but also building, creating communities as well. And then finally, just thinking a little bit about why should the church adopt non-violence? So obviously we can think about faithful witness to the kingdom of God, to the example of Jesus. But the Catholic Non-Violence Initiative also talks about how this would be a really powerful example to the world. So they say that this would lead the world away from perpetual violence and war by expanding its investments in its intellectual, pastoral, academic, diplomatic, and financial resources, in developing and promoting non-violent practices and strategies. And essentially part of the argument here is that the part of this is the call to be faithful, but also the church as a global organisation has got a massive reach. So if it could promote these practices and strategies, that would be a huge mobilising force. And I think also quite importantly, it would produce a church that is non-violent and that doesn't do harm. So that's also reflecting on the church's own violence of things like clerical abuse. Has anyone got anything they want to raise at the moment, or any questions about? I know it was a bit of a brief summary of everything that we've read. But any questions that they wanted to raise? David? Hi, we can hear you.
Sorry, me or Hugh?
David, do you want to go and then Hugh can go?
Yeah, two quick comments on it. One is non-violence being inclusive, and certainly in relation to Israel-Palestine. The first Intifada was broadly non-violent and managed to involve everyone. And then next time round, it became much more violent. And it just became patriarchal. I mean, the task of men was to go out and be martyrs, and the task of women was to sit at home and pray for them. Yeah. The other is the extent to which talk about non-violence. Often people might well be persuaded of the theory of non-violence, but can't see how it's going to work out in action. And I remember when I was a social worker years back, one of the challenges about corporal punishment at home was that people just had no idea as to what there was between either saying "stop that" or "I'll belt you" and belting them. But whereas once they actually discovered that there were a range of other intermediate options, then it was something they were very happy to experiment with and share positive outcomes with friends and neighbours. So I think quite a bit of, I mean, the church is beautifully placed, if so moved, to do quite a bit of practical information and sharing as to what non-violent action can look like.
Thank you very much, David. Some really lovely examples. Hugh?
Yeah, my apologies for being late, folks. I think one of the challenges that we all face is to turn the analysis and the critique of human violence individually and collectively towards the church as a system and towards power relationships in the church. And I think importantly, we can see that in the child abuse scandal where, and it's now, we've moved into a space, I think, where quite often it's almost like people are either moving on very quickly or trying to, and the voices of survivors are very much diminished and minimalized. And unless you have a culture that names violence, then it means in many ways the silencing of these voices is the continuation and the perpetration of violence in an ongoing way to victims in the church. These are very difficult conversations, but I think if we're serious about it, we have to find ways of communicating that where people aren't intimidated by the power structures or can feel a comfortability in the alienation that might bring to them within their own church communities. But the real point I suppose I'm making there is how we upskill people to do that, not only in looking outwards towards non-violence campaigns in the world, but to somehow think that we as a community don't need to rigorously continue to apply them internal to our own systems. And I think that is a huge challenge for us moving forward. Thanks.
Absolutely. And that's in the book.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Hugh. Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to respond to that or any other points that are raised?
All right.
David, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it's just to come back on Hugh's thing. I mean, because there's a whole paragraph on page 229 about how mobilizing and sustaining a popular movement geared to non-violent action has to go hand in hand with forming civil society, strong communities. And this links in with everything from enabling the people of God to actually be the people of God effectively, through to a whole range of small-scale positive action that's going to give people enough trust in each other to actually work together, either in action or sort of in counterbalancing dictatorship.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. Is there anyone else wants to make a point? No. Okay, I think what I will do, because I'm aware we're running out of time a little bit, so I'll just put us into our breakout rooms for 10 minutes. And if we just think about what we've been reading, so what do we think about the arguments for opting non-violence, both practical and theological? Is there a particular argument you find most convincing? Maybe there's an argument you find least convincing. And then what about the arguments about the church and the church committing to non-violence? Has anyone got any questions before we go into breakout rooms? No. they should all be open now.
And I think I clicked on the wrong thing. Can you send it back to me?
That works
Oh,
for
thank you. Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
I don't think it's put you in a room, Marianne.
Oh, well.
Okay, so I think we're all back. So, definitely the breakout rooms go on longer than they should because I was having too much fun listening to everyone. So I think if we just briefly go around and just hear what people were talking about. So if we start with room 1, so that was Anne, Marie, David, and Rab. Anyone who'd like to volunteer to share?
Yeah, didn't realise we were going to be asked to do a report back on it.
You can just give a brief summary of what you were talking or any important points that you thought were raised.
Everything from Dietrich Bonhoeffer to situations that you're in where really non-violence just doesn't seem a feasible option at all, through to occasions where you wish you'd said something, but you found the setting that you're in was yes, I mean one which was going to be too negative if you did.
David. How about room 2? So that was Jan, Rosalind, Marianne, I think. And Zoom user, who's I'm afraid I have forgotten your name.
Well, Zoom user is Gareth.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I don't know. Just to kind of say that a bit about what we talked about was the effects on the people who perpetrate the violence. That if you're called in to be violent for whatever reason, like a soldier or whatever, that that has consequences for you personally. That's one thing that we talked about. We also talked a bit about like the differences between having this kind of just a practical, non-violence purely as a, well, we think it works, therefore we should do it, rather than having the gospel behind, scripture behind it. And I think we all kind of felt that, the reading, scripture leads you to to following non-violence, and then brought us round to a bit about the church and not dealing with the child abuse scandals and not really listening to people, either people who'd been abused or people who are at the margins of the church, and that we had a lot to learn, but that's proven quite difficult for some people in some places to follow through. I hope that's a reasonable summary. If any of the others have got anything else to add, but
Thanks very much, Rosalind. And Jan, did you want to raise something?
I was just going to add, Rosalind and I are both using Kindle, so the pages that we're asked to read don't
okay.
necessarily match up. So we're not quite sure if we've read things that we shouldn't have already, but we know that's okay. But we were both struck by the point that somebody made when they're told that oh, it's just natural, you know, human beings being violent, and he spoke about PTSD and
Yeah.
the effect of, and we'll speak about the effect on the human brain. For people like soldiers, people who are violent, who carry out those violent acts, and so if it's so natural and wonderful, why does it have such a detrimental effect on us?
I found that really
Powerful.
powerful. Yeah, really, really powerful. Thank you. Thanks for raising that, Jan. And how about group three? So that was Elizabeth, Hugh, Jill, and Kit.
Quite a lot of talk about the kind of personal experiences and looking at what's happening in places like schools and, you know, the roles of parents and some of the challenges and the new developments, for instance, in relation to how children behave at school, and looking at that as a challenge in terms of, are there differences in behaviour, are there different ways in which we need to look at how children are conducting themselves now, and maybe and there was some reflections that perhaps there were some losses in relation to how expectations of behaviour and how we teach behaviour. Also, this new development skills, which I hear very often, and it was articulated in our group today, which was parents coming and feeling they have to defend children's poor behaviour and have to be advocates for it, which is quite a significant cultural shift. And perhaps what happened in the past, which was, you know, when I get the belt at school, I'm 100 years old, though, your parents, if I said I didn't deserve it, your parents would say, well, you just think about it for one of the times you get away with something, you know, there was this expectation that was unhelpful. But it's almost maybe a sense that this is a big cultural shift, that advocacy for bad behaviour because of parental relationship is quite worrying. So that was discussed. And then a kind of general discussion, I think, about how the church and how does the church embed this non-violent dynamic into the life of the church in the world and get it publicised more, and about maybe perhaps we need to embed it in formation processes and seminaries and so on, and even for people in parish work, people taking on roles in parishes. So non-violence and conflict resolution skills are part of every formation training, just as a suggestion that, and maybe the acknowledgement, I certainly feel that maybe as a church we've only got the capacity to resource and do that now, that we never had that in the past. I hope I've not missed in, folks. Please jump in if I've missed in.
Thank you so much, Hugh. That's really a lovely, well, a range of lots of really important points, I think. Is there anything else that anyone would like to raise about any of the arguments for non-violence, or any other points that were brought up?
Just something I think we've tried to talk about before, which is, what do we do with our own afflictive emotions? I think even in this book, which is brilliant, there's somehow this sense that people just need to read this stuff and think about it and will absorb it. And I thought your story was brilliant about being at a non-violent event and then being faced with really difficult circumstances. What do we do with our own hate? What do we do with our rage and our aggression and our needs for revenge? And there are people who often feel when they're involved in this work that they will somehow magically, by the grace of God, lose that part of their humanity. I actually think when we go into non-violence, I think we're exposed to more of that in ourselves. That's part of the challenge. And so it's really just to raise that. This is something I feel when we're training people in ourselves, we need to be aware that these emotions that afflict us, that are not gospel often expressed, they're not going to disappear. And we need trained. We need to look at our internal life spiritually, psychologically as well.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh. I think that's a really great point. And I'm afraid I don't think we can cover all of that in the 3 minutes we have left, but I think definitely something that I think we should keep going back to, because I think yeah, that personal conversion process is really at the core of non-violence, really, I think, isn't it? So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. Before we end, Elizabeth has kindly said that she would share a poem for us to close on. And I'll stay on for a couple of minutes afterwards as well, in case anyone's got any questions. Marianne, did you want to?
I just wanted to do a very brief bit of housekeeping. There were some people who couldn't find the link today. The link, you'll always find a link on our Pax Christi Scotland website. There is a special page for Anna's stuff. The recordings of the programs are there as well. Her questions and so on, that's all there, but also the link is there. So never be looking for a link in all your emails, which I know is very difficult, and instead just whiz to the website and you'll find us there.
Thank you so much. All right, Elizabeth, I will hand over to you.
It's a poem that I wrote after the bombing of the Bataclan in Paris, but I've read it everywhere after everything. It's called Stand in the Light. Stand in the light. Allow the wild things to creep out of the shadows. Welcome them all, the wet, bedraggled things, the ones all spit and claws, the one who weeps and hangs its head, the one who stares and says, "Make me." Stand in the light. They are yours, washed and unwashed alike. Stand in the light and sing. Raise your voice as if there was no fear of darkness. Listen, and you will hear other voices, other songs, rough and sweet and dauntless, blues and canto hondo, pibroch, nanha, tanach. Stand in the light and sing. Their pain is yours. Allow it to hurt. Stand in the light. Be still. Light is what we need. Let it glow. Let it shine into the furthest dark to find the lost, forgotten hopes and warm them to new life. Allow it to grow and touch the ruined homes and hearts and show us what's to mend. Stand in the light. Be still. Become the light.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was a really, really beautiful note to end on. And thank you so much, everyone, for today. And I hope everyone has a really wonderful Christmas and the weather cheers up at least a bit.